Hey guys, welcome back to Not So Sirius. My name is Tommy, and today I'm going to be joined by Sam, Joe, and Michael. Today we decided to talk about the past and future of human space exploration, given the recent events of SpaceX Demo 2 astronaut launch set to take off May 30th, 2020. As always, please leave any questions and concerns down in the comments below for us to answer in a future episode of Not So Serious. Without any further ado, we hope you enjoy. Peace.
Sounds good. Ready?
Okay, let's do it from the perspective that space is cool. So, in light of that, let's start with the launch of Sputnik in, I believe, 1957.
October 4th, 1957.
Excellent. That I guess one of the shocking things with Sputnik was that whilst rockets had been a thing since the Second World War and the development of ballistic missiles, the idea of sending something into orbit, I mean, that was just
It was a very weird feeling, I'm sure, for people on Earth, especially in the U.S., knowing that above them, I know like in movies, there's that scene where there's people looking up and then there's a little blink, like flashing on and off, which would be Sputnik 1 moving across the night sky. And so it's definitely scary knowing that not only was the Soviet Union developing ballistic missiles, but also that they perhaps in the future were capable of putting
yeah.
men in that
And
capsule or like
I mean,
secret surveillance
Sputnik
devices.
was only in orbit for, I believe, 100 or so days, but and its only functionality was that it could broadcast a radio beep. So people everywhere with any kind of radio set could just tune in to Sputnik and hear it go beep beep over your heads. Which, if you were a Cold War era American, would have been one of the most frightening things, knowing that
For sure.
just above your head there's this spinning thing and no one can do anything to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
That was the beginning of space travel. But
Yeah, in the space race.
yes, but one of the key stepping stones in the space race was one of the key goals of the Cold War space race was manned space travel,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what was the most impressive. Even though human beings being in space can't do that much themselves without they can't be automated away.
Yeah. But I think what's interesting about that is that I think for the U.S. that putting man in space and putting a man on the moon, that was our ultimate finish line. But when you look at it, the Soviet Union was the first to put, of course, the satellite Sputnik 1, and then I think months later, they put up Sputnik 2. They were the first a couple years later to put up the first man, the first dog, first just about everything. Like if you go down the list of first, the U.S. was just the first, to put a man on the moon.
Yeah.
I really wonder if the Soviet Union had been so active with space travel. Like, I wonder if the U.S. would have been so eager to actually get into space then. Because I don't think it was a really big deal until, like, the U.S. realized, oh, like, we're in competition now. And they seem stronger than us because they're
It
doing
definitely
this.
goes back to those Cold War era kind of fears of the other country, knowing that they're getting ahead of you in their technology.
Yeah, because, like, that was, like, a really big deal back in the day.
And I mean, Reagan gave his "Let's go to the moon" speech in 1960.
Reagan?
Not Reagan. JFK gave his "Let's go to the moon" speech in 1961, which was right around the time of Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that time was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, things like that. And if you look at a chart of NASA spending as a percentage of total government expenditure, it's been 1% of the U.S. government expenditure. I mean, NASA has been 1% of the U.S. government expenditure for 50 years now, but in that brief period of the 1960s to the man on the moon, it was all the way up to 5%. I think that that's a chart that we can include later in the editing, but that considering that space was 5% of the US government expenditure, that just means that getting a man on the moon was the
Also high
nation's
priority.
priority
Right.
from 1960
Yeah.
and 10 years on.
Yeah, and at the time when Sputnik was launched, the U.S. was far behind in terms of their rocket technology. Even though we had a lot of German scientists working at the NASA facilities and developing the rockets, there are a lot of I don't know if the U.S. necessarily saw themselves at the same level as the Soviet Union yet. And I don't think it was until we started our Mercury program and then our Gemini and Apollo program that finally people started to see that we had a chance of putting man first on the moon.
And I mean, the other thing that's roughly noteworthy is that the entirety of the Mercury program was playing catch up. It wasn't until Gemini that first were being achieved. And the crucial thing, I think, is the Soviet Union's complete failure to get a man anywhere close to the moon. The rockets that the Soviet Union was building never made it off the launch pad.
No, I think historically they have one of the largest in terms of thrust rockets, but I think it failed twice.
Yeah, and I believe that in one of those failures resulted in, I believe, the biggest conventional explosive explosion ever, which is frightening. Given
one feat to be,
And so the Mercury program in the U.S. that started like late 50s, 1958, I believe, because around the same time NASA started. And then I think just a couple years before, or a year before, that's when the Soviet Union put the first man in orbit, which would have been Yuri Gagarin.
Yep, in 1959.
So Mercury means they have one person, Gemini 2 people, and Apollo 3 people. Right?
Apollo 3. And I mean, Apollo was the crowning achievement of Kennedy's dream.
Mm-hmm.
And in that it clearly established the US's dominance in the space world. It enthused the nation. It was really the final element of the space race. And after that, we end up in a completely different era of space exploration, of human space travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think when the Mercury program started, there was at least it was discussed in the book, The Right Stuff, which is about all the Mercury program astronauts. And so the one argument would be a lot of those to be astronauts were before test pilots in the Air Force, and a lot of people didn't consider themselves consider those astronauts to be actual pilots, because they're themselves in a tin can launching from a rocket, and they just click buttons every once in a while, and that was about it. There's nothing like what they were experiencing when they were test pilots or in the Air Force.
Yeah, and I mean that was a much more cavalier era of space exploration, where the only of human space flight, where the only objective was, let's get one step further into sending a human being into space. And then I mean, with up till Apollo, the objective was always, let's get human beings further and more impressively, in some sense, irrespective of the actual technology that gets us there, irrespective of the cost, which was tremendous, given that NASA was spending 5% of the US budget at the time.
There was a lot of money and also a lot of risk, I'd say, just because Apollo 1, that mission with the fire in the crew capsule, I think they put stuff on hold for at least a few months after that accident when the astronauts.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, I mean, the Apollo. If we then look at into the future a little bit from there, we have the space shuttle era, and the space shuttle era was far more destructive in terms of how many people it killed than the Apollo, Gemini, Mercury era. In that Apollo, up till the end of the Apollo program, only 3 people had died on the US side in space exploration in general, whereas the space shuttle had 2 complete failures that killed 7 people.
But I think Yeah,
each.
and there was a book a few years ago by one of the people in mission control. I think his name's Gene Kranz. And basically, the title of the book is "Failure is not an option." And that was the mantra of NASA, like starting from its beginning. Failure is not an option. I think that has to do. I mean, it sounds like a good mantra, except that when NASA is putting so much effort just to make sure that nothing bad can happen, that kind of illuminates like how worried they were about everything failing because of some kind of boom.
Yeah,
Or
I
some
mean,
kind of death.
a lot of people say that. So, I mean, if we then look at the objectives that the space shuttle era set out to meet, you have making space flight cheaper,
Mm-hmm.
more repeatable, and and you have and making it more and making space more accessible to technology,
Yeah.
and things like that.
Yeah.
And in many regards, the safety aspect went down because the objective of the space shuttle was to be reused. And a lot of people say that during the Reagan era, that mentality at NASA shifted from safety first to let's be more productive, which I mean it is hard to back up with evidence for me, but a lot of people, including Feynman, have talked about how NASA's attitude in the space shuttle era shifted, and the safety became less the focus.
Yeah. And also, less of the focus. I would say 1972 was the last Apollo mission. We were landing on the moon. Like for years after that, or during the last few Apollo missions, people were looking at Mars as the future. Like if you looked at a Time magazine cover, it would say the future is now, or the future is Mars, or something along those lines. And then only a decade later, after the last Apollo mission, 1972, you have us just going to low Earth orbit. Just us, going up and correcting a lens on the Hubble Space Telescope, and us doing very small experiments, which I think is interesting.
Apollo opened up the door for untold possibilities of human space exploration.
It was Reagan's era.
Reagan
wanted to go again, right? To the moon or something like that.
Am I
wrong?
No. But
who's the president? There's one person that revamped the space program, I think.
I mean,
really ambitious. It might have been Reagan.
Every president administration,
they always talk about it.
I wanting to go to the moon again or something.
But nonetheless, Apollo enthused a nation, and Apollo said everything is possible. Less than 20 years, or just actually, about 25 years after the development of the first practical jet engine, we have people on the moon. And then all of a sudden, that's over, and we're sending people.
I think a lot of that has to do with, as we started the podcast talking about, are those Cold War tensions, where people weren't, there wasn't too much or as much going on. And by 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. And then after that, there's no talk about going back to the moon for the most.
Yeah, well, and I mean, even earlier in that, the Soviet Union went bankrupt was in serious disarray much earlier than that. And the other noteworthy thing is that the Soviet Union lost its chief designer, Sergei Korolev.
Oh, that's right.
And he never got to finish the moon mission. And once the Russians lost the race of the moon, nothing huge came out of Russia except for the Russian space shuttle equivalent, the Energia thing. But that only launched once, and I mean, the space shuttle was competing against no one, and even then, I mean, not that
it was just the pursuit of science.
And even then, the space shuttle was not. If we go back to those three aims, of making space cheaper, of making it easier to send payload to space, and on having reusable spacecrafts. The idea of this, it didn't really meet any of those three. The idea of, so you have, first of all, it was massively costly. Every time a space shuttle needed a turnaround, it would cost $450 million at the time to get it back from the landing strip to the launch pad, whereas an entire Russian Proton rocket from scratch only cost $100 million. And the Proton has roughly the same carrying capacity as a space shuttle. So the space shuttle was 4.5 times more expensive in terms of the payload it could get to space than the Russian Proton rocket. It was also clearly not so safe. It wasn't able to meet the high turnaround rate that was anticipated from it. So the space shuttle didn't give, the idea of the space shuttle was a good one. The premises that it, the problems that it set out to solve were interesting ones, especially relevant at the time when the focus shifted from let's send a man to the moon to let's make space more commercially viable, and let's exploit space more. But the space shuttle didn't provide the right solution to that, at least.
But I think it did, as you said, provide the idea of reusability. And going in through the 90s and in the early 2000s when Blue Origin, and I think Blue Origin started before SpaceX, but I think that's definitely the idea that they took and ran from the space shuttle.
Yeah, well, and then the space shuttle is interesting with the ISS in that the ISS is much an extension of the same kind of philosophy that led to the space shuttle, in that the ISS, well, in some ways, it was a continuous human presence in space.
Yeah. There were so many space shuttle launches when they were first in the late 90s building the International Space Station. A lot of those launches of the space shuttle were just to bring up payloads. To put it together.
Right. Because it's all modules, so they can add and take away anything they want.
And I mean, the ISS has an interest. I mean, the reasons for setting up the ISS are, I think, they're interesting, considering the price tag that it comes with.
Yes,
right.
The ISS, the most expensive human endeavor in all of this.
It's 150. I mean, I think we're up to 150 billion USD.
And every year it costs $3 billion to upkeep.
Yeah. Although to be fair, if you can textualize that, for example, for the Europeans, the European share of the ISS comes down to €1 per year per EU citizen goes to the ISS, which is not a lot given that's how much I lose behind my couch every year. But nonetheless, the ISS has a fairly weird mission in that it sets up continuous human presence in space, but that had already been done with the Russian Mir program fairly well, because some of those Russian Mir stations were up for years.
Yeah, it was Skylab first, then Mir. Is that correct?
I believe Skylab. Well, because the Russians had the Salyut program first, I think, but so the Russians have several Salyut space stations. Then they have several, I believe, several Mir space stations. So the idea of continuous human presence in space, that as well is an interesting one, because what's really the point?
Well, I know for the ISS they need constant human presence to monitor all the scientific experiments that are going on.
Yeah,
because I know there's a lot of stuff that requires a lot of maintenance in order to get all the data that they need.
Yeah, but I mean the science that's being done in the ISS, whilst it is interesting, I'm told that you can grow proteins in microgravity much better than you can grow them on Earth. I know that we've learned a lot about fluids and fluid dynamics based on microgravity. I know that it is interesting to have humans in space, because we learn critical things about, well, it teaches us critical things about the technologies that are and the future possibilities of sending humans further into space. So I know that having humans on the ISS teaches us on osteoporosis, things about osteoporosis in space, and how humans age, and the whole cosmic rays.
But it's not like, until recently, it's not like it's been space exploration oriented. It's been for a lot of the stuff that's still grounded on Earth and figuring out stuff that we couldn't necessarily discover with gravity. But it's never, I don't think it's ever been until probably the last 8 years or so, focused on leaving and going further than the moon.
Yeah, and I mean the and on top of that, having a continuous human presence in space from so many different nations should be a good thing, in that it keeps us. It makes sure that it's one thing. It's at least a way that humans across the different continents can stay connected in our exploration of space, which should be or could be an international effort. And it would be nice to know that everyone on Earth is striving towards the same goal. But on the other hand, that comes at a very expensive price tag. And it can, I suppose, can be hard to justify all of that.
I think also if you didn't have a continuous presence in space, or like a mostly continuous presence, I think NASA and other space agencies would be worried about the public's perspective on space. Because if you always have someone in space always producing some kind of scientific result or some kind of interesting picture taking of Earth, or talking with astronauts over the television, then I think people would slowly kind of lose that sense and that connection to space and exploration.
Yeah.
Because at least in the Apollo era, we had launches, all the time. And then this is kind of like the equivalent of always keeping up the public's interest in space, is by having people always in space.
I'm skeptical about how effective that is, given that I have not followed since. I mean, I've never really followed space launches, because it was always either the space shuttle or the Russian rockets. But I don't see. It's hard for me to see how sending 3 people in a Russian capsule that's existed since the 70s as well. Yes. We should keep that in mind. The Russian Soyuz capsule has existed since the 70s. It's hard for me to see how that can keep the excitement of space alive for young people, and I mean for people everywhere. That it's hard to see how that satisfies that goal.
Yes, but you don't have to worry, because it's going to be decommissioned anyways pretty soon.
Yes.
Right.
And I mean, we are.
Well, a lot of the science experiments now, like Voyager and Hubble and stuff, it didn't require like manned missions to do those experiments. Yeah. It's just some like robots and a radio connection.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, would that same amount of would that same energy with the same amount of energy going into the ISS, would that be better spent, for example, trying to pursue going to Mars, making space more reusable? Because I think one of the problems with the ISS and the way that we've been using it is that it's been quite stagnant for a while. So we had the space shuttle, but that had been around for 30 years before the ISS. And then we have the Russian capsules that have been going there. The technology for getting things to space has not changed radically with the ISS there. The only thing is that we've seen SpaceX take over some of the payload delivery to the ISS and their whole reusable rocket thing, which is pretty exciting and hopefully a step in the right direction.
Like, I also feel that so much of all of this with like developing technology for space, it's just going to require a lot of time. I don't think we can rush any process. I think maybe part of the reason why the ISS has to stay up so long is because like these things take time.
Right.
Going to space takes time. Getting familiar with the space environment takes time. And I think that's the reason why it has to be so stagnant, because you can't rush any of this.
Right. Like
you can't have repeated experiments where people die, There has to be a certain level of familiarity with all of this that I feel has to be achieved before you can rush like, oh, we need to go to Mars. Oh, we need to go further and further and further, because it just takes time.
The reason why, though, is like the reason why it's really hard to do that and take your time is because of how, at least in the U.S. with NASA, is how the presidential 4 years works, where the different administration for the most part comes in every 4 years. You have a different perspective, a different idea. First you want to go to Mars, and now you want to go to the moon. It's always shifting, and so it's really hard, I think, to balance the politics and the funding of space with the actual science that goes into it.
And the whole, sorry, Tommy, the whole concept of let's rush, to get back to the moon, to go to Mars, to get further, that has in some sense no end goal and there is no good there's no pressing need for us to do that, except that I would like to see that happen within my lifetime. Given the context of humanity, there's no pressing need for us right now to get to Mars.
Yeah.
The other question that entails then is why should we spend so much efforts to get human beings to Mars and further, given that those efforts might be better placed in saving our own planet?
Yeah, or not even sending humans to space, but also just sending 10 times more robots than humans,
telescopes.
Because it's a lot cheaper to send and a lot safer to send a robot rather than a human. But I think also the human presence in space, of course, brings up that sensation.
Well, you can code a robot to do certain things over and over on Mars, but sometimes it's like in a lot of movies, you need that human intuition to really create those new ideas. So unless you have someone that's like controlling the robot 24/7 and it has full capabilities as an AI, it's
send it like software updates. If you could send a robot that's on space, software updates for it to So I also feel like.
But then if you need a new feature, and it's physical.
The human being is only as equipped as as the equipment that you send with him.
Yeah.
So yes, I acknowledge the fact that the Apollo astronauts made some measurements on the surface of the moon, and I acknowledge the fact that they placed some instruments there. However, those instruments could easily have been placed on the moon by an unmanned probe and achieve the same results. I really don't see how the astronauts can't miraculously pull a measurement or a result out of the air. Yeah. I suppose they can notice something, but given that astronauts can't yet spend that much time on the surface of something, given that astronauts, are human beings and they can't get so far in a given day. The astronauts have a lifetime as well. They're not, whereas robots can just keep going. And I don't, for example, with the Apollo, I don't imagine that a robot would have done a worse job than the Apollo astronauts given the same amount of budget.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the fact that people aren't going to tune into their TV in 1969 to watch the Apollo 11 launch, to watch a robot land on the moon. They're going to want to watch it.
Technology might not have been as good back then, and developing that technology now seems like a real possibility because there's AIs that know everything there's possibly to know about anything you want it to know. But the thing is, like organizations like NASA, they're not just one facility, they're like multiple facilities. So I know there's a few in like Florida, there's one in Houston, Texas. And the thing is, you think of NASA and it's like one big group, but in reality, it's a bunch of separate facilities that a lot of the times end up spending a lot of money and a lot of effort developing the same things and then not telling the other institutions about like repeated development. So a lot of the times, the Houston facility will make some magical telescope piece to work on something, but then down in Fort Lauderdale, they're also working on the same thing and wasting a lot of time because they don't share a lot of that communication with each other and a lot of that development.
And there is something to be said that by going through the pains of sending human beings as opposed to robots, we also learn a lot about technology, which we clearly do.
Right.
The Russians were capable of putting a probe on the moon, because they did before, I believe,
multiple times. The Luna missions. I think.
The Luna 10, I think. Missions were on the moon before the Apollo astronauts got there, I believe.
And I think they're one. So the one idea or the one purpose of sending someone to the moon was to get an actual return sample and bring it back to Earth.
Right.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think
the Russians did that without people.
The Russians almost did it before the U.S. in terms of, I think their rover, which I think is called Luna, failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so given that the Russians were able to put a probe on the moon, but we're not able to put men and women there, that clearly shows that the technological burden of manned space travel is a lot higher than it is for unmanned space travel.
Mm-hmm. But then you also have the hindrances with developing the technology that won't fail, and that you'd actually get the results that you wanted as well.
Right.
If you're putting that much research and development into it, though, it shouldn't be as big of an issue.
Well, it's either like you put all of that effort to making like a safe capsule, or you put all of that effort to making like a competent robot.
I mean, I just think that like our traveling into space would get a lot easier if we knew more about space. And I think the only way we know more about space is if we explore more. That's why I think it would be much more interesting to see NASA and stuff develop telescopes, like getting James Webb finally up, things that will actually give us more insight into what space looks like and feels like, for us to better understand like the different environments and capabilities, so that we can travel further. Because I think we're limiting ourselves, and I think the whole we need to have a human factor to make it more interesting just shows that how poorly NASA and other like companies and space like rocket development agencies are just doing a poor job of communicating how it's so interesting that we can send technology up to space. I think,
like I said, they can't even communicate between themselves, you know.
Yeah, the fact that we have to have a human presence for all these missions, like to make it interesting to the government, you know, to fund companies and stuff like that. I just think it's poor communication on like what you're actually doing with these technologies, you know.
The other argument that I think we shouldn't forget for spending money on space, to be on a more positive note, spending money on space is not lost money. By spending money on space, you are employing scientists who who are not paid a lot of money, and they do work that objectively will benefit humans at some point down the line. You are employing manufacturers who make critical components. You are giving people experience in complicated fields. Spending money on space exploration is not wasted money at all. It's always something that goes back into the economy. Even if you consider the fact that for a long time, everything that we send into space would get burned up on re-entry. Even the miners pulling the materials for that out of the ground, we're benefiting from the fact that those rare materials were being pulled out of the ground to go into a rocket. So in some sense, I don't want to overstep here, but in some sense, spending money on space is not really money that gets lost. It's never lost money. So it just
has a slow return.
It just has a slow return, right?
It just seems really inefficient the way things are being done.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely inefficient, but
granted, there are a lot. Like, I mean, we talked to. It's going to come out with Meyer. That was with Meyer, but there's a lot that you have to go through to fund projects and different things like this. But and there is like a census, that the survey that people take every 10 years, a decadal survey, to like
Yeah, there's a lot of red rope
processes you have to where to research. Yeah, it just seems frustrating that it seems this inefficient that.
Like it's for a good cause, but it's just done in a poor way.
Well, imagine. I don't know if that's necessarily. Sorry, Mike. I don't know if that's necessarily so true, because space technology has given us quite a few returns, and on top of that, we are in the context of time. It's only been 110 years that humans have even been able to fly. And now we are seeing big changes in the way that we're going about space exploration and manned space flight. We are going in, SpaceX is now doing its thing, and SpaceX has now introduced technological changes that up till a couple of years ago were only possible under the supervision of a government. SpaceX has made reusable rockets a reality that we hadn't ever achieved. Hopefully other companies like Blue Origin and and I mean, every kind of investment in the space industry a lot of investment in the space industry at the moment is heading in a fruitful direction. And I think good things are going to happen soon. And then we can also consider that Artemis mission, where we're going back to the moon by 2024, which
Right.
I know we've been told that quite a lot in the last 20 years.
Well,
But
I've even heard
this
that
time,
we want to establish not even just going back to visit, but like establishing like a base of
Establishing a base.
operations.
And then
Yeah,
also
well-
basically the equivalent of the International Space Station around the
yeah, and I mean that's pretty well underway. The human module, the Orion spacecraft, has already been built. The SLS rocket to support that mission is, I believe,
It's
is being tested.
yes,
And then
very delayed.
And I mean that's extremely exciting in that hopefully having a human base on the moon, that's serious change from
Right, like that's a big step in like evolution, you know.
That's true.
Mm-hmm. As long as you get the right group of people together and the right minds, and everyone has the
Right.
same, I think,
And it's not even
idea of
just
where
like
they want to be.
Or even the people that are funding the mission have the right goal. Instead of sending up a base to like mine the moon, possibly, because that's like a possibility, is it not? People want to spend
Right.
moon's resources, you know.
At the moment, if we are indeed looking to go to Mars, we need to learn a lot of things. We need to learn how to build settlements on foreign.
Right, and that's what the rovers and robots are good for. It's like testing those things out, it's being safe with it, you know.
Yeah,
until we know more.
The biggest issue of launching from Earth is the gravity and the fact that it costs so much to escape Earth's gravity well.
Yeah.
And so going to the moon, going to beyond to Mars,
Like a pit stop.
the biggest issue I think is trying to figure out what we can build in situ or build out of the resources we have available on the moon or on Mars.
Yeah,
Kind of
well,
If it's like an
settlements
ISS thing, though,
soil.
I'm sure they would be sending constant resources.
Yeah, but
I think it would be like a stockpile, would it not?
The idea of
we'd use what we
settlement-
can get on the moon, but like, you know, I don't think uranium and stuff is on the moon. So if we ever need like nuclear reactors or, you know,
but I mean,
plastics.
I think that's a little far out. But on the other hand, for example, if we are to build settlements on Mars, we need to know how to build them correctly out of mostly the resources that we have there. So, for example, if that means taking inflatable tents from Earth and then covering them in materials that we can find on the moon, if we can develop technologies that can help us use the resources that we have there as much as possible, that's really the objective, I think, of the Artemis program, is to teach us how to make do with the local resources, because we've never tested building space grade habitats for human beings elsewhere than on planet Earth, and to be able to do that on Mars, we have to first do that on the moon. And so that's pretty interesting.
Right. And it's like Michael said, like gravity is probably the number one most energy sucking thing that you could ever find. So launching to the moon is going to be a lot cheaper by it's going to be like a tenth of the price and then a tenth of the amount of energy to go from the Earth to the moon and then launching off the moon with the weaker gravity.
Yeah. And I mean, it has, building a space station has already been done a lot of times, but I think having that what is it called, the lunar gateway, the space station that they're planning to build around the moon, that'll teach us a lot about how much stuff we can assemble into space, because the cost of sending something into space is reduced if you can reduce its size. So
I think go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
If we can send several smaller payloads, I think it's more efficient than us having to send at once a giant Mars rocket. So that'll help. Then we'll be able to see economies of scale and things like that we haven't been able to do before.
And I think it'll be interesting how private space companies will collaborate with NASA and other federal agencies going to the moon and going to Mars, just because the SLS rocket is, for the most part, I don't think it's reusable. And so you have one of them and then you need to build another one. Whereas I know SpaceX right now is developing not only their Falcon 9 and their Falcon Heavy rockets, but also the Starship
BFR.
rocket, or the BFR, which is like basically comparable to NASA's SLS.
Mhm.
Yeah, and reusable, I think.
I mean, it's all
Right.
beneficial to those companies if we can get to the moon, because it makes their costs cheaper and makes more people able to actually,
Right.
you know,
Like
Yeah.
working with the agencies gives them a meaning besides privatized space. Like they get to cooperate with the agencies and like get big government contracts, which gives them a lot of money. But then it also, going to the moon first reduces prices for everyone.
Yeah.
And but however, there are a number of unsolved problems in that we, for example, have radiation, which we have no effective solution for at the moment. Which, if we want to go to Mars, that's going to be a massive problem in and of itself, because
Right.
as far as the technology that we have now only tells us that the only way to protect human beings is to surround them by vats of elements that are heavy in hydrogen, like water. But we know that sending water to space is not really a possibility.
Right.
And for example, the Apollo astronauts were exposed to incredibly high doses of radiation, and
Only for short periods of time.
sorry,
But only for short
but
periods.
only for short periods
Right.
of time.
But going to Mars, your trip goes from like a few weeks to nearly a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, even when we get to Mars, we encounter problems like Mars is not an active planet, so it has no strong magnetic field, which means that it's not protected from solar radiation, which is a huge problem for potential colonies there. And there's still no effective solution to that. So
Right.
I apart from, I guess, burying ourselves under the Martian surface, which could be, I guess we could do that.
But
The only
excavating is so
There'll
more
just be a
expensive than
Mars
building stuff.
sunscreen. There'll just be a Mars sunscreen.
Okay, dude. All right, buddy. Cover yourself in about 5 inches of sunscreen and pray.
I actually wonder if it could go into genetics then. If there's going to be some sort of adaptation where it's just, we're going to find a gene strand or whatever that is really good against.
The thing is, like, from the amount of science that I know right now, the whole point of radiation is that radiation is enough energy that it can break bonds. Right. And that causes, and the reason why radiation is poisonous to human beings is that it breaks down.
Right. Now here's a little bit of biology for y'all, right? So you got your cells and you got your DNA that's, instead of just in long strands, it's all curled up in like balls, and then it bonds together so it doesn't break apart into one big strand and then fall apart. But then the radiation has enough energy to break those bonds, and so your DNA starts to scatter apart within the nucleus, and then that causes big problems. Because then you can't copy anything anymore.
Saying it's like a planet of Hulks on Mars by 20. Who
Planet
knows,
of
dude?
Hulks
I'm just saying,
okay, dude. Okay,
dude, if we can absorb that radiation, we could just have superhumans living on Mars.
I'm sure there's some solution,
but more importantly than it not being able to replicate, low doses of radiation encourage genetic mutations, which never go for the better, and they always end up being cancer.
Well,
so,
to be fair, that's also how evolution works. It's just small mutations.
But what I was going to say is I don't believe that life is at all sustainable.
Probably not.
I don't think that we can adapt. I don't think that
not at least carbon-based. Yeah,
exactly. I don't think genetics can adapt to, it doesn't matter whether it's carbon or anything else. I don't think that genetics can adapt to a high radiation environment, given that genetics can't replicate effectively in a high radiation environment. So it might just be that life on Mars might not be feasible, in terms of having lots of people there, and more than I don't think it's feasible in terms of having more than just a very small exploration colony. And the other thing is that Mars is not heavy enough to maintain a good atmosphere, as we learned, which means that
We'd have to plant a lot of
The
trees.
possibility of terraforming Mars is really very not very real,
Right.
as we know. So going to Mars in some sense might just be for the exercise of going to Mars, which I suppose would be an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
But
Also,
it
or
hasn't.
it could be like the moon, where it's just another pit stop. It's just
Yeah.
gonna be another pit stop place before we find somewhere else that's
Right.
way more suitable.
Yeah.
You know,
I think also it's also the mindset we have right now, and so going to Mars right now seems very infeasible in terms of humans,
Surviving.
carrying out their lives and
Right.
surviving on the surface or underground. But I think that's also the mindset we had when we looked at going to the moon. No one in the decades leading up to going to the moon, no one thought it would be possible, and then we did it. And the same thing probably with just about every other space achievement that the world
And
has made.
it is true that going to Mars likely has no end goal in my lifetime. But part of being a member of a species is looking after your species' survival and long-term future. And the idea that going to Mars might give us is an extra stepping stone in humans being able to explore out of our solar system. That in and of itself makes going to Mars a fruitful exercise.
very valuable. Yeah,
Mhm.
very valuable.
And even if right now the laws of physics as we understand them don't really seem to be conducive to human beings leaving the solar system, because human beings don't live long enough to last for space travels that go outside of the solar system at the speeds that
You would need
today's physics allows us to achieve.
Right.
However, as we know, flight was once considered impossible. So who knows whether.
But then not only that, we went from flight to having, a couple petabytes fit on a table.
Yeah, right.
Like that's a lot. Back in the day, the first computer, a couple petabytes would be probably the size of New York City and like Manhattan Island, and now like it can fit on your table.
Well, I mean, given
crazy.
that data was first stored in writing and numbers, and then we somehow managed to compress that into something that has stuff going on that's stored.
I wouldn't rule out anything, especially because like
all it takes is the right thought, the right idea, the right invention, a
right
different perspective in approaching the problem of Mars. And
I do think though there's a level of the scale of difficulty. It gets exponentially a lot harder. Like, I'm sure with all those discoveries, it was feasible at a certain extent, and then like with the way current physics is and the way what we know currently, unless there's some groundbreaking discovery, I think it could be pretty difficult to.
But I mean,
on the other, it's impossible by any means, but it's just the scale of learning something new.
Like, it's going to be more expensive and require more people like be really smart,
But that's not entirely that's not necessarily true. In that, I mean, what I'm getting to is that it's not because it doesn't have a near future goal that we shouldn't embark on science. And I think this is a fairly big. This is a point this is something I like to talk about, is that for hundreds of years at least, science was only done for the sake of science and had no practical application. Newton never thought that when he wrote down that the force of gravity is proportional to the mass of the two objects over the distance squared, Newton never thought that would one day allow us to send rockets between different planets.
True.
When Boolean operations were invented, when binary arithmetic started, it was only
like electricity was for light, and now look what it can do.
Right. And I mean
I'm just saying, like
a lot of those things, a lot of science has no near future applications.
Yeah.
But it's only by pursuing those that we end up with something meaningful. Alan Turing, for example, faced there was very little before him, and look at what he was able to do with maths that was at some point considered completely useless. I mean, for example, when
like his goal was to just decode, secret messages, and now he's given us computers.
Yeah, and for example, when someone thought of the complex number, they never thought that the complex number would be used in solving every differential equation, well, a lot of the differential equations that we now have. They never thought that the complex number would allow us to even be a part of our description of nature, which it so eminently is a part of now. So in some sense, pursuing science for only the exercise of pursuing science is not a bad idea at all.
Yeah.
And I think that brings us to the launch this upcoming Saturday. In terms of, a lot of people may be asking, why are we launching just 2 people from Florida on top of a Falcon 9 rocket from a SpaceX facility, when we can just, not do it at all, or just have the Russians do it? And so it's the long-term effects, and not knowing exactly what it's going to lead to, but knowing that if you continue to do it and you continue to pursue it, that like the science will bring a lot.
Right. Like if we can prove that we can send people up safely and then bring the rocket back down, that opens an entire floodgate of different opportunities we have to go to Mars and go to, out of the solar system. It's setting the foundation for bigger and better things.
And we shouldn't let ourselves think either that this is only a repeat experiment of things that we were able to do 50 years ago. This new SpaceX rocket is a technical difference, is new, even though it's quite subtle. Being able to reuse rocket boosters entirely is a huge,
saves trillions of dollars.
Is going to be
it's insane,
huge step for us. Having so many computers on board a rocket is going to be a first. Having 4 people,
touch screen, or it's not a like a joystick.
Yeah, I mean, it's
touchscreen.
It is a big difference. The materials have progressed tremendously in the last couple decades, so we are seeing big changes. Hopefully, even though this rocket isn't achieving immense things that haven't been done before, it is an important technological change, and it is a good place to start with. Again,
there's a level of. Sorry, go ahead.
I think this is a good way of creating the spark of interest of space, of human space exploration.
Yeah, there is a level of repeatability with this, where if we can do it multiple times, we get more familiar with it, and then it becomes easier, and it won't be as difficult or as dangerous to repeat experiments like this.
It's like the first time you ever ride a bike.
Yeah.
Like it was super clunky with the the space shuttles and stuff, but now it's just like second nature, Yeah.
And we improve on things as well, and we adapt. And so if we can get the process to be stable, then we can continue to improve and update things, which is good.
Yeah. And so for those listening to the podcast right now, we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, and then the SpaceX launch for their Demo 2 launch from Cape Canaveral is going to be this Saturday, I believe, the 30th of May, 2020, at 3:22 p.m., as long as it's not delayed as it was yesterday. And so I think that, any other last words?
I think that's it. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.
Subscribe.
This guy, dude.
Space is cool.
And I should also say that this episode is going to be uploaded on a Friday, just because of the unique circumstance of the launch being on Saturday. We're going to have it up before then. But other than that, all of our episodes should be uploaded, or at least the Not So Sirius series of our podcast should be uploaded usually on Sunday afternoons, not Friday. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. And yes, like and subscribe.
And if you would like to see anything on the channel, it can always be left in the comment section. Or if you look at the link in the description, there is a link to a Google form thing that lets you tell us some stuff.
Just comment below if you want to see.